I'd like to thank UCCS for allowing us to host this vigil, and thank all attendees for showing your support for Ukraine in these very difficult times. Today we gather here to remember those who have already lost their lives in this conflict, and to support those that are currently fighting for their freedom, their rich Ukrainian culture, and for their lives. My name is Dr. Evgenia Christina Olesnitska. I stand before you here today as a Ukrainian American. I would like to take this opportunity to tell you my story, the story of my Ukrainian family. To be clear, I tell you this story not because it is my story, but rather because it is the story of millions of Ukrainians in the diaspora community and in Ukraine, and because I believe that telling my story will give a greater historical context for the current assault on Ukraine by Putin's regime. Indeed, the Russian persecution of Ukraine and the assaults on the Ukrainian culture, its language, and its people is not new. Likewise, the strength, the bravery, and the spirit of Ukrainians and the love of their land and culture is not new. It is ingrained in our very being. I stand here before you today wearing my traditional Ukrainian shirt called a vyshyvanka, a traditional Ukrainian coat called a kiptad, as well as a traditional wreath. But most importantly, my grandmother, Dr. Lida Kurylak's necklace. I am a first-generation Ukrainian American. Like many others in the diaspora community, I grew up in New Jersey, in the New York City metropolitan area, in a very tight-knit Ukrainian community. Ukrainian was my first language. I attended a Ukrainian school from preschool until 8th grade. I was taught all the standard courses any American would encounter in school, but I also learned Ukrainian grammar, literature, and history. In addition to this, I very reluctantly, and that is an understatement, attended Ukrainian Saturday school, where I daydreamed about watching Saturday morning cartoons. And I kid you not, sometimes I actually tried to escape Ukrainian school, and I would change the clock when the teachers weren't looking so that we could get out sooner. In the summer and over winter break, I would gather with other fellow Ukrainians to attend Ukrainian scouting camps, sports camps, ski camps, all held in the Ukrainian language. It really wasn't until I went to high school that I started to socialize with other Americans my age. And so I hope you can understand that while I am a very proud and patriotic American, I also very strongly identify as a Ukrainian. As a young child, I already knew the horrors my family faced just for being Ukrainian. And it has always kept me grateful for what I have and grounded as a result. I remember my grandmother, Lida, who was born in 1920, telling me stories about starving and trying to survive during the Stalin-imposed Ukrainian genocide of the 1930s. Many people are unaware of this genocide that Ukrainians refer to as Holodomor and English speakers refer to as the Great Famine. This was a time when Ukrainians were forced to work their fields, but they were not allowed to harvest their grain or other crops. In fact, Soviet soldiers would set up sniper towers and shoot anyone who was trying to quote-unquote steal food. Food that they grew to feed the Soviets while they starved to death. It remains astonishing to me how few people are even aware of Holodomor. In 2003, the United Nations made the following official statement regarding the Great Famine. In the former Soviet Union, millions of men, women, and children fell victims to the cruel actions and policies of the totalitarian regime. The Great Famine of 1932 to 1933 in Ukraine took from 7 to 10 million innocent lives and became a national tragedy for the Ukrainian people. leaving deep scars in the consciousness of future generations. We deplore the acts and policies that brought about mass starvation and death of millions of people. We do not want to settle scores with the past. It cannot be changed. But we are convinced that exposing violations of human rights, preserving historical records, and restoring the dignity of victims through acknowledgement of their suffering will guide future societies and help to avoid similar catastrophes in the future. Millions of Ukrainians starved to death by Stalin over the course of 1 year. Let that sink in for a moment. And yet, here we are today. Ukraine is an incredibly fertile land in Europe. Indeed, it is referred to as the breadbasket of Europe because it has something called Chornozem, which translates to black earth, a very uniquely fertile soil. Its land can in fact feed most of Europe. Our Ukrainian flag, displayed here on the lawn, reflects this integral part of our history, with the blue symbolizing the blue sky and the yellow the golden fields of wheat. So it's not surprising that many different countries and empires and regimes have coveted Ukraine because it can feed their people. In fact, Ukraine was a fierce battleground between the Soviets and the Nazis in World War II. Between 1943 and 1945, 14 million people died in Eastern Europe, killed by Hitler or Stalin. The grim realities, the toll taken on Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe, are recounted by Timothy Snyder in his aptly named book, The Bloodlands. I encourage you to try to read the book. I personally can't make it through very many pages because it is so painful to read the atrocities that our people suffered. Ukraine's losses during World War II were enormous. 5 to 7 million people killed, 700 cities, towns, 28,000 villages destroyed, 10 million people left homeless. Among the most infamous atrocities against the Ukrainian people during the war occurred during the massacre of Babyn Yar, where over the course of only 2 days, in September of 1941, 34,000 Ukrainians were killed by Nazis. It was during World War II that my family fled Ukraine. My mother's family from Kyivska Oblast became privy to the murder of many intelligentsia and decided to flee. My mother, her parents, my aunt, and grandmother boarded a train to get closer to the border, but they were caught in an air raid. As the train slowed, people ran, trying to escape the bullets, and in the commotion, my biological grandmother was killed. My grandfather handed my very young mother to his mother and his sister, Lida, the woman I call my grandmother, told them to keep going, while he stayed behind to bury his wife. He was arrested by the Soviets, who falsely claimed that he was a German spy, and was sent to a labor camp in Siberia. My mother didn't even know he was alive for 25 years. My great-grandmother, my great-aunt, or the woman I call my grandmother, Lida, and my mother walked all the way to Austria, where my mother grew up in a displaced persons camp in Salzburg, until they ultimately gained passage to the United States. It was in Austria, however, that my Buselida finished her medical training and became a doctor. Just think for a moment about how beautifully that reflects the strength of Ukrainians, and particularly their women, today on International Women's Day. It's already incredible for a woman born in 1920 to become a physician, but Lida did it against all odds. When the professors of her medical school were murdered, her medical degree was put on hold while she escaped. And yet, while her family lived in a displaced persons camp, she finished medical school in Graz in Austria. She came to the United States with my great-grandmother and my mother. She set aside her pride and she worked menial jobs until she could learn English and pass the certifications to practice as an anesthesiologist. I've always been struck by the strength, the courage, and the resilience of the Ukrainian people. Let us fast forward to today. How can this be happening again? Today, in 2022. Today, I watch our people stand up to oppression, and it is evident that the fire inherent to our people has not died, but rather it is alive, and the flame is only burning hotter and brighter as our culture and our country are attacked. I still have a lot of family in Ukraine. I'm grateful that about 20 of them have made it to Poland safely. My cousins on my father's side bravely stayed behind to fight. And I'm so incredibly proud of their amazing efforts to work with people all over the world to bring medical and military needs to Ukraine. One of my mother's half-brothers, his children and grandchildren are in Russian-occupied Ukraine, in a region between Chernobyl and Kyiv. We lost contact over a week ago. Even then, they had run out of food and water. They had no heat and no electricity. The last contact I had from them, they were being incessantly bombed in their town. They were afraid to leave because people, and even their dogs that ventured into the street, were brutally murdered by the Russian occupants. My cousin and her daughter were in Borodyanka at the last contact I had with them. Oleksiy Kuleba, head of Kyiv's regional state administration, released a statement on Saturday. There is no Borodyanka. It is almost completely destroyed. While I try to hold on to hope that my family is still alive, I have to be realistic that they very well may be gone. But this does not have to be the case for other people in Ukraine. So let's stand with Ukraine. Let's remember those who have been lost, and let's support those brave men and women that are fighting for their freedom and fighting for their lives. I will end momentarily, and I hope that you find in today's program, though it's very cold, more than just a vigil, but a meaningful Ukrainian cultural experience. We are incredibly grateful to have local and world-renowned musicians performing tonight to showcase our beautiful culture. We begin this program with various members of local choirs performing a song that most of you are probably very familiar with, Carol of the Bells. Most people don't realize this is actually a Ukrainian song. Its words have been changed in the English arrangement, but our performers tonight will be singing the original words, though translated in English. The song was composed in 1916 by Mykola Leontovich. It's important to note that he was murdered by a Soviet agent in 1921 because of his involvement in the Ukrainian independence movement. At the conclusion of our program, you'll hear another famous Ukrainian song, my favorite song, Chervona Ruta. The song was composed by a medical student, Volodymyr Ivasyuk, in the 1960s, and it actually won the USSR Song of the Year in 1971. 1979, Ivasyuk was found hanged in a forest in the outskirts of Lviv in western Ukraine. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but evidence points to the KGB in murdering him for inspiring a Ukrainian nationalistic sentiment through his music. Again, I thank you all for your support and your attendance on this very cold night, and your willingness to learn about and experience our beautiful and rich Ukrainian history and culture. Glory to Ukraine, glory to its heroes. Slava Ukraini! Heroyam Slava! I'd like to take just a moment to have a moment of silence for those that we have lost.